The world's largest aircraft, the Hindenburg, prepares to depart for New Jersey.
The last Hindenburg survivor died in 2014, but not before making a stunning confession. For 77 years, he kept quiet about what he really saw that night. He signed documents, he stayed silent, but on his deathbed, he finally broke. He revealed that multiple passengers weren't who they claimed to be. Secret agents were on board. Someone was planning to destroy the ship. The survivor's final words expose a cover-up that reaches the highest levels of government. The Hindenburg explosion was just the beginning of something much darker. The Hindenburg began as an idea born from a nation that believed the sky was theirs to conquer. Germany had been obsessed with Zeppelins for decades, and by 1936, their engineers were ready to build something bigger than anything that had ever lifted into the air. Under Dr. Hugo Eckener's guidance, the LZ-129 Hindenburg slowly took shape inside the giant shed at Friedrichshafen. When it finally rolled out, its size almost didn't feel real. It stretched about 245 meters long, nearly 803.5 feet, with a diameter of 41 meters. Nothing else in the world even came close. Inside its sleek duralumin skeleton were 16 huge gas cells holding almost 200,000 cubic meters of lifting gas, more than 7 million cubic feet. The original plan had been to fill those cells with helium because helium didn't burn. But the United States had been the only major supplier of helium since the 1920s, and it had banned all exports back in 1925. They saw the gas as too rare and too strategically important. No exceptions were made, and certainly not for Nazi Germany. So the builders turned to hydrogen. Hydrogen lifted more, which made the ship faster, but it carried a shadow with it because everyone knew how easily it could burn. That choice would follow the Hindenburg for the rest of its short life. Even with that risk, the finished ship felt like a floating palace. When it launched in March 1936, newspapers called it the pride of German engineering. 2 full decks were dedicated to passengers. There were 25 cabins, an elegant dining room, a spacious lounge, even a pressurized smoking room that existed only because of elaborate safety tricks to keep any flame sealed behind thick doors. Max Schulze, the bartender hired specifically for that room, stayed alert every second, making sure no cigarette or cigar wandered out. Everyone working on board knew the unspoken truth. This airship was beautiful, but it was also fragile in a way people preferred not to think about. For a while, though, it delivered everything it promised. 4 Daimler-Benz diesel engines pushed it through the sky at about 125 kilometers per hour, around 78 miles per hour. It could cross the Atlantic in half the time of the fastest ocean liners. In 1936 alone, it completed 17 round-trip crossings, 10 to the United States and 7 to Brazil. Each one was smooth. Thousands of passengers flew safely, and the ship covered 1 million miles without a single injury. Travelers enjoyed fine meals, looked out from the long gallery windows at the curve of the clouds, and ordered cocktails from Max Schulze as if they were in a luxury hotel. People called it the last word in speed and comfort. It was the first aircraft to run regular passenger service between Europe and the Americas. For many months, the dream of airship travel seemed stronger than ever. Still, the fears never vanished. Eckener had pushed hard for helium, warning that hydrogen always carried a risk no amount of skill could erase. But the Helium Control Act in the United States closed that door. Some German officials brushed the danger aside. Captain Ernst Lehmann often said with pride that the Hindenburg had operated safely for years on hydrogen. Yet even he once heard a quiet warning from an American airship supporter who told him he hoped Germany would never regret that confidence. Those words would return with terrible weight. As 1937 arrived, The Hindenburg prepared for a new season. Its first North America flight was planned for early May. By this time, Eckener had been pushed aside for political reasons, and Captain Max Pruss held command. Captain Lehmann, one of the most experienced airship men in the world, joined the May flight only as an observer. He had been grieving deeply since the recent death of his young son. He carried that sorrow with him as he boarded, along with something else that troubled him. A letter had reached him warning that a bomb would destroy the ship on a future flight. It came from Milwaukee, written by someone he did not know. He did not believe it would happen, but the words disturbed him enough that he kept the letter folded in his pocket as the ship lifted off from Frankfurt. There were also 3 Luftwaffe officers on the passenger list: Major Hans Hugo Witt, Colonel Fritz Erdmann, and Lieutenant Klaus Hinkelbein traveled in civilian clothes, officially to study long-range airship operations. Some people much later claimed they had a secret mission to stop a saboteur, but Witt denied this during the United States inquiry that followed the disaster. He said the only unusual thing was an extra careful baggage inspection before departure, triggered by another anonymous warning. Once the airship was in the air, no one mentioned sabotage again. Military observers had joined flights before, so their presence did not raise suspicion. If anyone dangerous was on board, they stayed completely hidden. The real danger was something much larger and much quieter. The Hindenburg left Frankfurt on May 3, 1937, at 7:16 in the evening. It carried 36 passengers and 61 crew and trainees. Among them was a sharp and eager 14-year-old cabin boy named Werner Franz. This was only his second trip to America. Dressed in a neat uniform, he spent his time carrying coffee to officers, cleaning, and trying to prove he deserved his place on board. He had landed the job only because his older brother had whispered his name to the right person the previous autumn. Werner wanted to show that the chance had not been wasted. Dawn was only beginning to rise on May 6, 1937, when the Hindenburg came racing down the northeastern coast of the United States, trying hard to make up time. It was supposed to land in New Jersey that morning, but delays pushed the arrival into late afternoon. Even with the setbacks, everyone on board felt light and excited. By mid-afternoon, the ship drifted over New York City, and the passengers pressed against the windows, staring down at the endless grid of streets and buildings. At 3 in the afternoon, the Hindenburg made a slow loop around Manhattan, giving everyone on board a view they would never forget. Werner Franz later said, "It looked like an ocean of buildings, with cars and people so tiny, they seemed alive only because they kept moving." It reminded everyone just how huge the airship was. It stretched 245 meters long, almost the length of the Titanic, gliding like a floating city across the sky. By 4 in the afternoon, the Hindenburg reached the Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey, only to find that a line of spring thunderstorms had rolled through. Captain Pruss decided not to fight the gusty winds and rain. Instead, he moved the ship into a gentle looping path along the Jersey shore. Down on the ground, Commander Charles Rosendahl and his crew advised him to wait. So the Silver Giant drifted above beach towns like Seaside Heights and Asbury Park. People on the ground stared up in awe whenever it broke through the clouds. One Toms River resident later said, "It just kept going back and forth like it was wandering the coastline." Finally, near 6 in the evening, the storms began to fade. The rain stopped and the winds calmed to around 18 to 25 knots. At 6:22, Lakehurst radioed the captain and told him it was safe to land. By 7 in the evening, Pruss brought the airship back toward the field to attempt a flying moor landing, which meant dropping the lines from about 200 feet, so the ground crew could winch the ship down. It was a familiar move for American airships, but still new to the Germans, who had tried it only a few times the year before. Even so, Pruss felt steady and sure. In the control car, he called for the engines to slow as the last adjustments began. First Officer Albert Samt vented hydrogen from the forward cells and released water ballast to balance a slight heaviness in the tail. The ship slowly descended to about 600 feet, moving toward the handlers waiting below. At 7:21, with dusk settling in, the final steps began. Ballast had been dropped in 3 releases, together weighing about 100 kilograms of water. When the ship reached roughly 180 feet, crewmen opened the bow hatches and threw down the thick mooring lines. First, the starboard line dropped, then the port. Ground crews grabbed the ropes and started fastening them to the winches. A brief sprinkle of rain began to fall. Inside the control car, Captain Pruss and Captain Lehman felt a light jolt when the port line tightened too much, but they thought it was nothing more than a rope pulled too hard. They had no idea that in the tail of the Hindenburg, something far more dangerous had already begun. Only minutes later, at 7:25, the disaster arrived. Several people on the field saw a strange flutter along the top of the ship near the tail. It looked almost like a gas cell was leaking, and the outer skin puffed for a moment. Navy Lieutenant R. Hankins Ward later said he saw a wave-like ripple between frames 62 and 77, right where gas cell 5 sat. Someone else thought the rear cover sagged inward near the port side engine. At the same time, a faint blue glow shimmered along the skin, likely static from the storm-filled air. In only a second or two, a muffled boom came from inside, and then flames burst out. A plume of fire rose from the top of the Hindenburg just ahead of the upper tail fin. Commander Rosendahl said it looked like a bright orange flower blooming across the dorsal spine of the ship. Others saw fire shooting out near the rear port engine and the vents of gas cells 4 and 5. Within another heartbeat, the entire tail was burning. From below, people could see the giant rudders and fins glow, then vanish into smoke. Radio journalist Herbert Morrison, who had been calmly describing the landing, suddenly screamed. His voice cracked as he shouted that the ship was on fire and falling. His words, "Oh, the humanity," would echo across the world for generations. For those inside the ship, the destruction came with stunning speed. One moment, they were ready to step off onto the field, and the next, the world became a roaring furnace. Helmsman Helmut Lau was in the lower fin, manning the auxiliary steering post, when he heard the dull boom. He saw a flash, then the interior of gas cell 4 glowed red and yellow. A few seconds later, the cell simply vanished in the heat. The fire leapt from one hydrogen cell to the next. It sucked in fresh oxygen and grew white-hot as it tore through the framework. Molten pieces of metal and burning fabric fell everywhere. As the rear lost lift, the tail sank fast. The bow, still full of hydrogen that had not yet caught fire, shot upward. The airship pitched at almost a 45-degree angle. People inside were thrown down through the decks. In the A-deck dining room, Margaret Mather was hurled 15 to 20 feet against a wall. On the starboard side, Major Hans Hugo Witt had barely crossed the lounge when the cry of fire pierced the room. The floor tilted sharply, and he slid helplessly through a crashing flood of chairs and tables until everything piled against the rear wall. Smoke and heat filled the lounge, and through a crack in the ceiling he saw the fire glowing above them. As the tail slammed into the ground, flames shot from the nose, which was still high in the air. 9 crewmen were in the bow, tending the mooring lines. When the fire raced forward through the catwalk, it blasted out of the nose like a blowtorch. Most of the bow crew had no chance. Many died instantly. Some jumped from the hatches, but fell to their deaths. Rigger Erich Spehl and 2 others survived the first burst, only to suffer terrible burns. Spehl died later that night. Across the ship, survival depended entirely on where a person stood and how quickly they could get out. Those closest to the outer windows escaped more easily. Those deep inside had almost no hope. Chief Steward Heinrich Kubis opened the large promenade windows and shouted for passengers to jump. Many did. Most survivors jumped from heights between 20 and 50 feet, before or just as the ship hit the ground. Circus acrobat Joseph Spa kicked out a window and leapt, breaking his ankle but living. Others jumped onto the sand or grass, some hurt but alive. Some of the most heartbreaking moments came from families trying to escape together. Matilda Daner and her 3 children watched the landing from the portside dining room. When the tail exploded in flames, she grabbed her 2 boys, Walter, who was 10, and Werner, who was 8, and threw them out of the window. Both survived. She tried to lift her daughter Irene, who was 16, but could not manage it. With the fire closing in, she had to jump herself, breaking her pelvis, but living. Irene was later rescued, but died from severe burns. Their father, Herman, had stepped out moments before the fire began and never returned. Many members of the crew stayed at their posts, despite knowing the danger. Helmsman Lau died in the lower fin. Radio operator Willie Speck kept sending messages until he was overtaken by flames. Rigger Ludwig Knorr jumped at the last possible second and survived with heavy burns. In the crew areas on B deck, Max Schulze, the beloved bartender, was likely cleaning the smoking lounge when the fire started. Kubis said he had seen Schulze wiping the bar only minutes earlier, after serving his last drinks. When the flames came, Schulze was trapped. He may have been knocked down by the sudden tilt, or overcome by thick smoke. The 60-year-old bartender never made it out. His remains were found in the wreckage, and his death certificate said only that he died in the Zeppelin explosion. Severe burns. When the flames finally sank into the field at Lakehurst, the world expected nothing but death. Yet when the smoke thinned, something strange appeared through the haze. People were crawling out of the wreck. Some limped, some stumbled, and some walked as if pulled back from the edge of another world. Out of 97 souls on board, 62 survived. On the ground, 1 Navy crewman was killed when wreckage fell over him. In all, 36 lives were lost, and many more carried burns, broken bones, and memories they would never shake for the rest of their days. Even in that horror, brave hands moved without hesitation. Navy men, who had been frozen for a breath by the sight, snapped back into action. They rushed straight into the fire to pull out the living. Chief Petty Officer Frederick Bull Tobin roared, "Navy men stand fast," and his crew obeyed, dragging survivors out as explosions cracked around them. Fire crews and medics arrived within minutes. People were ferried to the base infirmary and local hospitals as fast as bodies could be lifted. Through the terror, there were moments of almost unbelievable courage. One of the most astonishing stories belonged to a boy who was not supposed to make it out at all. His name was Werner Franz, the 14-year-old cabin boy whose job that evening was simple: clean up the officers' mess, stack dishes, and hope the weather cleared so he might get shore leave. When the landing alarm rang at about 7:15, he kept working. He wiped down tables and filled the cupboard with dishes. Then he heard a dull thud behind him. The floor shivered. That was the port rope hitting the ground. The lights blinked out, and an instant later the whole ship jerked upward with the tail rising sharply. All the plates he had just stacked burst out of the cupboard and smashed across the floor. Werner stepped into the keel corridor to see what had happened, and the sight almost froze him where he stood. Far down the gangway, a ball of fire was racing toward him. The entire stern was engulfed, and the flames were tearing through the hydrogen cells. Heat blasted through the corridor. Werner stumbled backward up the steepening catwalk, grabbing at ropes as the ship tilted even higher. His feet slipped. For a second, he felt himself sliding toward the fire, and he clung to anything he could reach. Later, he admitted he was sure his life would end right there. Then fate dropped something on him that saved him. A ballast tank mounted above him ripped loose as the structure folded in on itself. Hundreds of gallons of water came loose and crashed down. The torrent soaked him completely and shocked him awake. It also coated his clothes enough to shield him from the worst of the heat rolling forward. Airship historian John Proven once said that Werner had been in the only place in the ship where such a miracle could happen, directly under a tank that burst at the perfect instant. Now dripping wet and able to think again, Werner remembered something important. There was a small provisioning hatch up ahead on the starboard side of the keel. It was a narrow square opening used to load supplies. He tried to climb toward it, but the ship's angle was still too steep. He had to cling to a rope and wait for the bow to tilt downward again. When the ship finally dipped, giving him a few feet of level ground, he lurched forward. He reached the hatch, braced himself, and kicked it open with both feet. The cover flew outward. Below him, the ground was rushing closer, maybe 20 feet away. Werner jumped. For a moment, he felt the ship rising behind him again. The bow had bounced on impact, giving the boy a split second to move before the burning shell dropped down again. On instinct, he remembered his training. Never run with the wind. The flames were blowing in the direction of his fall, so he spun around and sprinted upwind under the hull. Only seconds later, the rest of the airship collapsed exactly where he would have been. Had he run with the wind, the fire would have caught him. He stumbled out from under the falling wreck, dripping, bruised, and shaking. He checked his body in disbelief. He had no burns, no broken bones, just wet skin and pounding breath. Wet, but alive. Those were his first words. After escaping, the stunned teenager helped throw water on the remaining fires. The next day, he walked back to the smoldering skeleton of the ship with Lieutenant George Watson. He wanted one thing: his pocket watch. It was a gift from his grandfather, and he had kept it with his belongings in the officers' mess. Picking his way through the charred debris, he found it exactly where he had left it, scorched but still whole. He also grabbed a small piece of aluminum framing as a keepsake. Many years later, he would show that slightly warped watch to reporters as proof that his story happened exactly as he remembered it. People often called his escape the most unlikely of all. Airship historian John Proven said with awe that Werner survived the crash without a scratch, something few could believe after seeing the footage. Werner never bragged. He always said it was luck, training, and that sudden waterfall from above. In the years that followed, he answered letters from anyone who asked about that night. He told his story simply, ending it often with that same line that had carried him out of the fire. Wet, but alive. Other voices rose out of the Inferno, each carrying a shard of truth, each shaping the memory of that night. Major Hans Hugo Witt was one of them. He had been pulled from the flaming wreck by comrades, half-conscious and wrapped in smoke. He remembered sliding across the lounge floor as the ceiling above him glowed red, the heat pushing down like a warning. When he scrambled to his feet, he saw at once that the ship was going down. There was no time to think. He sprinted toward an observation window, jumped from a height of nearly 20 feet, and trusted the dark below to catch him. He never remembered the fall. He only knew that when he opened his eyes again, he was on the ground, stunned, and surrounded by flames. Collapsing wreckage must have struck him, trapping him under metal and burning cables. By chance, Lieutenant Hinkelbein, the same officer who had stood near him at the moment of ignition, landed close by and saw Witt lying motionless with a fiery cable wrapped around his neck. Hinkelbein rushed over, pulled at the hot wires with the help of another man, and dragged Witt away from the collapsing debris. Witt was alive, but barely. His face, head, and hands were burned. He was rushed to the Lakehurst Base Hospital, then moved to Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan the next day for specialized care. Weeks later, he slowly began to heal. On May 28, 1937, still bandaged and in pain, he gave testimony to the U.S. Commerce Department. He spoke of the sudden shout of fire, the dull blast, the tilt of the ship, the jammed door that refused to open, and the heat that pushed him to jump for his life. Like Franz, he insisted that he had seen no bomb, no trace of sabotage, only a sudden burst of fire and an instant fight to live. He carried those burns for the rest of his life until he passed away in 1976. Another voice shaped the tragedy in a different way. It belonged to Herbert Morrison, the reporter whose emotional broadcast has reached millions. His recording was so intense that many believed it had been aired live across the nation. But it was actually played the next day. His voice cracked as he watched the ship fall, and when he choked out the words, "I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen," and sobbed, the world felt the moment with him. Years later, he explained that when he cried, "Oh, the humanity," he believed everyone on board had died. When he learned that most had survived, he told listeners he hoped his first words had not made it sound worse than it was. His raw description, paired with newsreel footage, turned the Hindenburg disaster into one of the earliest media-driven catastrophes, replayed in cinemas and radio rooms across the world. Some survivors turned their shock into testimony. Among them were German journalist Leonhard Adelt and his wife Gertrude. They had been guests of Captain Lehmann and escaped with injuries. In the Lakehurst infirmary, Adelt saw a sight that stayed with him forever. Captain Ernst Lehmann sat quietly on a table, gravely burned yet oddly calm, watching the chaos around him. Adelt stepped closer and asked, "What happened?" Lehmann, barely able to lift his head, whispered one word, "Blitzschlag," the German word for lightning. Even in agony, he was searching for a cause. Adelt left to receive treatment, not knowing that he had just spoken to Lehmann for the last time. Overnight, Lehmann's condition worsened. His burns seemed less severe than Captain Pruss's, but hot gas had scorched his lungs. On the morning of May 7th, Commander Rosendahl visited him in the hospital. Lehmann was lucid, almost serene, more worried about the future of airships than his own fate. Knowing he did not have long, he discussed every possible explanation for the disaster with Rosendahl. Every theory led nowhere. He mourned the ship he had loved so fiercely. Then he made one final recommendation with total clarity. Regardless of the cause, he said, the next ship must have helium. It was a hard reversal from his earlier stance, a grim acknowledgement that the warnings he once dismissed had been right. As their conversation drew to a close, Lehmann gave Rosendahl his last judgment. He looked him in the eyes and said quietly, "It must have been an infernal machine." In those final hours, he believed only a deliberate bomb could have created such destruction.